Okay, but real talk for a sec. How many times have you looked back at like old photos or even like those cringy social media posts from years ago and you're like, who was that person?
Yeah, man, it's crazy how much we change, right? And that's actually what we're going to try to unpack today, this whole idea of the self and like how it changes over time.
Yeah. It's definitely a question that's been puzzling philosophers and scientists for like forever. We're still kind of trying to figure out what it even means to be you. Is it like a fixed thing, or are we more like, you know, that river analogy you always hear about? Always changing, but somehow still the same river.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And you know, you sent us this really interesting YouTube video. It's called If Your Mind Changes, Are You Still You? It's by The Rational Mirror. And it really got us thinking about this whole paradox. Like, we feel like we're one continuous self, but like, our bodies, our beliefs, even our experiences are always shifting. So where does that leave us? Where's the truth in all? Well, one of the first things to consider is that our brains are like incredibly dynamic. You know, neuroscience is showing us that basically every experience we have, every new thing we learn, every emotion we feel, it actually reshapes the connections in our brain. It's what we call plasticity.
The video actually uses that analogy of the ship of Theseus, you know, the one where they ask, like, if you replace every single part of a ship, still the same ship. And it really makes you wonder, if our brains are constantly changing, at what point does all that change mean? We're not the same person anymore.
It's a really powerful metaphor. And if you think about specific parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, which is like super important for memory formation, you can actually see how every experience contributes to like the rewiring of those neural circuits.
Wow. So it's not just a philosophical thing. It's like physically happening in our brains. Our brains are literally different than they were a year ago. That's kind of wild. But then there's the whole memory thing, right? We tend to think of our memories as proof of who we are, like our memories define us. But the video makes this point that memory itself is actually surprisingly unreliable.
Yeah, it's true. We often treat memories like they're recordings of events. But the truth is, every time we recall a memory, we're actually reconstructing. It's less like playing a video, more like rewriting a story each time.
So basically, we're all unreliable narrators of our own lives.
Kind of, yeah. And that whole process of reconstructing memories, it means they're really prone to distortion. We might accidentally add details or leave things out. Sometimes we might even completely rewrite events and not even realize it.
Which totally explains why you get into those arguments with friends, where you both remember the same event completely differently, and you're both positive that your version is right.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole question of self so tricky. If our memories are that malleable, how much of who we think we are is even based on accurate information?
Right. It really makes you wonder. And what about those cases of amnesia where someone loses their memories? Does that mean like a fundamental part of their self just disappears?
Yeah, big question.
It makes me think that maybe there's more to self than just the brain, even if the brain is kind of like the hardware it all runs on. The video makes the argument that how we interact with the world matters too. Our relationships, our habits, all that stuff might be just as important to who we are.
There's a whole field called embodied cognition that's looking into that. It's not just about thoughts happening in isolation. It's about how our bodies and our actions and our environment all work together to shape how we experience being ourselves. And then there's this concept called extended mind, which basically says that our minds aren't just limited to our brains, but they actually extend outwards into the tools and technology we use.
So it's not just me in here, it's me interacting with everything around me. That's kind of a mind-blowing thought. And you know, like, think about all the different roles we play in life. You're not the same you with your family that you are when you're giving a presentation at work, for example.
Right.
So do all those different versions of you contribute to the bigger picture?
That's where social psychology comes in. We all have different social roles, and each of those roles comes with certain expectations and behaviors. Those things influence how we act and even how other people perceive us. But it's not just roles. There are also these broader social and cultural influences. Think about how the communities we belong to shape our values and beliefs. Even our language is influenced by our social context.
So it's like self isn't just this one solid thing. It's more like this constantly evolving collection of experiences, our actions, and even how we fit into the world around us. Yeah. It's a really different way to think about it.
The video actually introduces this idea that the self is more like a story. It's a story that we construct, and it's not static. It's a narrative that we're constantly weaving together from our memories and our beliefs and our experiences.
So it's less about trying to find this true self that never changes and more about understanding that we're always in the process of writing and rewriting our own narrative. That's actually a pretty cool way to think about it. But if that's the case, if we're always changing, does that mean there's no solid core to who we are?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, because the video points out this really fascinating parallel between what ancient philosophy and modern science have to say about the self. And they both kind of suggest that there might not be a fixed I inside us after all.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So what are they saying?
Well, the video talks about Buddhism and the concept of anatta, which basically means no self. To use that river analogy,
Yeah.
The idea that it's always flowing, always changing. And what's crazy is that neuroscience is starting to see some evidence that supports this idea. Our brains are constantly forming new connections, letting go of old ones. There's a constant flow of activity. It's not like there's this little you sitting in your head controlling it all.
Wow. So both ancient wisdom and modern science are pointing toward this idea of the self as being more of a process than a thing. But if that's true, then how do we explain that feeling of being me from one moment to the next? If everything is in flux, what creates that sense of continuity?
That is the big question, isn't it? And it's something we'll definitely dive into more when we come back. We'll explore some possible explanations for why that feeling of me-ness is so persistent, even if the self it's based on is constantly changing.
Stay with us as we keep trying to make sense of this fascinating mystery of the self.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this whole mystery of the self. We were just talking about how maybe there isn't this fixed me after all, which honestly can be kind of a freaky thought.
It really can.
But there's also something kind of exciting about it too.
I totally agree. If we're not stuck with some rigid definition of who we are, did that open up more possibilities for growth and change?
Exactly. The video touches on this idea from some philosophical schools like materialism, which basically say that we are our brains, all our thoughts and feelings, even our personality, they're just products of what's happening in our brains.
So if that's true, as our brain activity changes, so do we.
Right.
I don't know, it still feels a little too simplistic to me. It makes us sound like we're just these walking bundles of neurons reacting to stuff. Surely there's more to being human than that, right?
Oh, for sure. It's way more complicated than that. And not everyone agrees with that whole materialist perspective either.
Yeah.
Some people argue that identity goes beyond just the physical brain.
Okay, so what else is there?
Well, they say it's about the patterns of behavior we have, the roles we play in our relationships, even the impact we have on the world around us.
So it's more about considering the whole ecosystem of our lives, not just what's happening up here.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a much more holistic view. Imagine if we could somehow make a perfect copy of someone's brain. Would that really make them the same person? What about all their experiences, their relationships, their whole journey through life? Those things shape us in ways that go way beyond just our brain structure.
It's like that saying, you are the sum of your experiences, right?
Right.
And those experiences are constantly shaping us and reshaping us.
And that brings us back to that other fascinating idea from the video, the idea that the self is more like a story that we tell ourselves. Rather than some kind of fixed thing, we're constantly weaving together these memories and beliefs and experiences to create this narrative that makes us feel like we have a continuous identity.
That totally resonates with me. It's like we're all the authors of our own life stories, constantly editing and revising as we go along. And like you were saying before about memory, that editing process can be influenced by so many things, our culture, our relationship, even the way we choose to remember our past.
Right. And that's why, like we talked about earlier, we can't always trust memory as being the ultimate truth of who we are.
Right. Right.
But even if it's not perfectly accurate, that narrative we create, that story of ourselves, it's super important for us to function in the world.
In what way?
Well, it gives us a sense of purpose. It helps us make decisions, and it helps us connect with other people.
So we need that story, even if it's partly made up, just to make sense of the world and our place in it.
Exactly. And this is where the video draws this really interesting parallel between ancient wisdom and modern science.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
They both seem to say that this idea of a permanent, unchanging self might actually be an illusion.
Wow. Okay. So are you talking about anatta or no self in Buddhism? The video talked about that, right?
Yes, exactly. And they use that river analogy, always flowing, always changing.
Right.
And what's mind-blowing is that neuroscience is actually starting to find evidence that supports this idea. Our brains are always rewiring themselves, making new connections, letting go of old ones. There's this constant flow of activity, just like that river.
So both ancient philosophy and modern science are pointing toward this idea of self as something that's more of a process than a fixed, permanent thing.
Exactly.
But then, how do we explain that feeling of being me, that feeling of being a continuous self from one moment to the next if everything is always changing? What gives us that sense of continuity?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a really good one. The video explores a few different possibilities. One idea is that our brains are basically wired to create this sense of coherence, this feeling of continuity. It's like evolutionarily advantageous.
Yeah.
It helps us make sense of the world, make decisions, build relationships. So even if it's an illusion, it's a pretty useful one.
So maybe it's like a necessary fiction, a shortcut our brains take to help us deal with reality?
Yeah, maybe. Another possibility is that even though individual elements change over time, there are still underlying patterns that stay relatively constant.
Okay, so like what kind of patterns?
Well, think about your values, your tendencies, the way you interact with the world. Those things can stay pretty stable, even as your thoughts and emotions are constantly changing. It's like a fingerprint, unique to each person.
So maybe it's less about finding one fixed point and more about recognizing those patterns, the patterns that create that sense of continuity in our lives. We're not static, but we're not completely random either.
I like that.
That's a good way to...
It really is. And it leads us to another really big question. If the self isn't this fixed thing, then what does define us?
Right. It can't just be the brain. And we've already talked about how memory isn't always reliable. So what is it then? Is it our actions, our values, our impact on other people? Or is it that awareness, that consciousness, the thing that experiences all this change?
Those are all great questions. And the video actually dives into a bunch of different philosophical perspectives on what defines the self. Some people argue that it's the continuity of our conscious, that awareness that stays with us throughout all our experiences.
So even if the things going on in our minds are always changing, there's something deeper that's observing it all.
Right. Like if you just take a moment to be aware of your surroundings right now, your breath, the sensations in your body, there's this sense of present being that's not tied to any specific thought or emotion.
That's interesting. It almost suggests that there's this whole other level of self that's beyond all the thoughts running through our heads.
Exactly. And some spiritual traditions like Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism, they point to this pure awareness as being the closest thing to a true self. It's not the stuff in our mind, but the space where all those thoughts and experiences appear.
Okay, so that adds like a whole other dimension to this. But wouldn't some people say that even that awareness is just another product of brain activity?
Oh, definitely, for sure. There's this ongoing debate about whether consciousness is something totally separate or if it can ultimately be explained by what's happening in our brains.
So maybe it's not an either thing. Maybe it's both. Maybe we're this mix of physical processes and something more, something that goes beyond those processes.
I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it shows how this question of self isn't just some abstract idea. It actually has real implications for how we live our lives.
Right. Because if we're not just these fixed things, if we're constantly evolving, does that mean we have the power to shape who we become?
Exactly.
What does that mean for our choices and our actions?
Those are some really important questions. And those are the questions we're going to explore when we come back. We're going to look at what it means to embrace this idea of a fluid self and how we can actively participate in shaping who we become.
This is getting really good. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a minute to continue unraveling this whole mystery of the self. We're back, and I gotta say, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around this whole idea of the self. It's like a story that's constantly being rewritten. It's super interesting, but also kind of scary, you know?
Yeah, I get that.
Like, if who we are is really that fluid, does that mean we're just kind of floating around in a sea of change without any real anchor?
That's a great question. And it really gets to the heart of what the video is trying to make us think about. If we let go of this idea of a fixed self, a self that never changes, what does that mean for how we understand our lives, our choices, our responsibilities?
Exactly. Like if there's no true self to hold on to, does that mean our actions don't matter as much? Does it like undermine our sense of purpose or even free will?
That's something a lot of people wonder about. But the video actually suggests that the opposite might be true. If we accept that the self is a process, something that's always being created, it actually gives us more power to shape that creation.
Oh, and
we're not just passive bystanders in our own life. We have the ability to choose how we react to things, how we learn from our experiences, and how we integrate those experiences into our story.
So it's not about clinging to some fixed idea of who we are. It's more about embracing this journey of becoming.
Exactly. It's like we're making the map as we go along, right?
Yeah.
We get to choose the direction, the terrain, the experiences that shape us. We're not looking for some predetermined destination. We're actively charting our own course.
I like that. That's a cool way to think about it. It makes it feel a lot less limited. But okay, so if we're always changing, what about responsibility? Can we really be held accountable for the actions of our past selves if we're not the same person anymore?
That's a tough one. And it kind of gets into this whole philosophical debate about moral responsibility and personal identity. But one way to look at it is this. Even though this self is always changing, there's still this thread of continuity that connects our past, present, and future selves.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Our actions today shape who we become tomorrow, and we carry the consequences of our past choices with us.
So even though we might not be the same person we were yesterday, we still have to deal with the effects of the things we've done.
Right. It's about recognizing that our choices have real consequence, both for ourselves and for other people. It's about taking responsibility for the narrative we're creating, even as we understand that it's an ongoing process.
The video also makes this point about how our identity isn't just about what's going on inside us. It's also about how we impact the world around us, like the ripple effect of our actions, our relationships, our choice. All of that contributes to who we are.
Absolutely. That brings in the social dimension of the self, the people we interact with, the communities we're part of, the roles we play. Those things all influence how we see ourselves. It's this constant back and forth between the individual and the collective.
So it's not just about who we are on the inside. It's also about how we show up in the world, how we connect with other people. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences become part of our story.
Exactly. And that's where we can find meaning and purpose, even if we let go of this idea that there's one fixed self.
So it's not just about me, me, me.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're all connected.
Yeah.
And that our lives have an impact on other people. It's about contributing to something larger than ourselves.
That makes this whole idea of a fluid self a lot less scary. It's like instead of losing something, we're actually gaining a whole new level of possibility and responsibility.
It's definitely a shift in perspective. It challenges us to think about identity differently, not as some static noun, but as an active verb, something we're constantly doing, creating and recreating.
So instead of asking, who am I? Maybe the question becomes, who am I becoming? Or even better, who do I choose to become?
I love that. That's a great way to frame it. And it brings us back to that question the video asks at the end. Are we searching for something that doesn't exist? Maybe this idea of a fixed, unchanging self is really just an illusion. A way to avoid all the uncertainty and responsibility. That comes with embracing the fact that we're always changing.
But, like the video says, maybe that fluidity is actually our greatest strength.
I think so.
It lets us adapt, to grow, to learn from our mistakes, and to constantly redefine ourselves as we encounter new things.
That's true. And it's a good reminder that none of us are finished product. We're all works in progress. There's no end point, no final destination, just this ongoing journey of becoming.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, I gotta say. Instead of trying to define the self once and for all, maybe we should just focus on writing a good story, a story that's full of purpose and connection and a lot of growth along the way.
That's beautifully said. A story worth telling.
Exactly. So to everyone listening, go out there and write a good one. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the self. It's a mystery that never gets old.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing this whole crazy, beautiful thing of being human.